All right, so welcome back to Common Sense Bible Study. And tonight we're talking about Common Sense Bible Study. One of the reasons that I created Common Sense Bible Study was to help people study the Bible. In going through books of the Bible, actually doing the study is helpful because, it shows people how other people study the Bible. But it's also very useful to give explicit instruction. Like, here's what you need to study and learn from the Bible. Here's how to read it. Here's how not to read it. Here are the tools that you need, those kinds of things. Tonight, we're starting at the very basics, and that's preparing for Bible study. This is, exactly what it sounds like. You are going to study the Bible. What do you need to be thinking about before you even open the book? So the first thing to think about is your environment. So that means the stuff around you. Everything, the room you're in, the space, the people around you, those kinds of things. Study materials. What are you using to study? Your Bible, your reference material, anything else, paper, pen, all that kind of stuff. And your heart and mind, because this is also part of preparing for Bible study. First thing to look at and to address in your environment are distractions. There is no end of potential distraction. This includes audio, visual, the things that you can hear. For a lot of people, any kind of noise can be a distraction. That means music, television, people talking, people working outside. If you live in the city and there's construction going on or traffic, maybe you're studying in a place where there's just a lot of background noise. I've got a refrigerator here on the other side of the room and the air conditioner nearby. Those kinds of things can really bother people. Visual is the same kind of thing. Visual distractions. Even if you put your television on mute, just the picture is moving around. It's going to catch your attention. You're going to want to look at it. People moving around will be a distraction. I think that for the most part, I think that seems pretty straightforward, how audio and visual things can be a distraction. However, there's another side to that. Sometimes audio and visual stimuli could help you focus, can help you remove distractions. One example of that is like white noise. I have some noise canceling earbuds. And recently I took a flight to Phoenix to visit my parents, and the noise canceling earbuds in the airplane, I sat down and I did some Bible study, broke out my laptop, cut out all the aircraft noise, the people around me. I mean, I could still kind of hear it. It didn't make everything silent, but it cut the noise 90%. And I was really able to concentrate on what I was doing instead of all the stuff around me. So that's a way that noise was actually helpful. I also use music. My desk is in the kitchen, and, Paula's in here sometimes, preparing dinner or doing other stuff while I'm working or studying. And, that's just the way that our house is laid out. I can't really avoid that without moving, setting up an office in another room in the house, and it's not really practical. But one thing I can do to eliminate distractions is to put some music on. And it has to be the right kind of music, the right rhythm or sound, something that isn't going to distract me, like going to be irritating. So there are certain kinds of music that I won't listen to. Scott and Shuba, I'm kind of curious if you have similar kinds of experiences and what kinds of distractions you experience, or what kinds of things you do to mitigate the audio and visual distractions around you.
So I do most of my studying early morning,
Mm-hmm.
and at that point there isn't much audio disturbance or visual disturbance, simply because I think, because of the fact that I get up super early, most of the household is asleep, and there isn't much noise coming from outside either.
Mm-hmm.
But interestingly, even though the physical distractions are not there, for me it's more like it's my own distractions in my mind,
Yeah,
which I
exactly.
have to be careful about. So yeah, I have to bring my mind, which loves to run all over, back to what I need to do, which is focus on, the studying part. So yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, my background music of choice is smooth jazz.
Hmm.
That's sort of, I find that to be a um, relaxing thing for my mind.
Hmm. Yeah, good. And Chuba, you mentioned the things going on in your mind. That's a big distraction also. The conversation you're having with yourself in your head. You're if especially if at certain times of day, if you're getting up in the morning and you also have to get ready for work, trying not to get into your work mode too soon, trying to keep from preparing for the day while you're preparing for Bible study. That can be a real challenge. And if you've got issues going on in your family, you've got somebody sick, breakfast needs to be prepared, dinner needs to be planned, grocery shopping, all these things that you've got to do and that you have to think about, that can be a serious distraction too. Another one is technical issues. If I use my computer for studying, it's been a long time since I've sat down with a paper notebook and a paper Bible to do my studying. But if I've got problems with my computer, if I've got a slow, creaky computer that can only handle a couple of apps at the same time, or it's frequently crashing, or I've got a bad internet connection, all these things can be distractions too. And even if they're not directly related to what we're doing, directly related to the thing I'm studying, that could be an easy distraction for me to want to go fix it. Like, I know my computer has this problem, and instead of focusing on the task at hand, I'll get distracted by, fiddling with stuff, trying to fix something or tweak something. I could spend a half an hour doing that instead of studying the passage I'm supposed to be studying. You hear a rattle in the refrigerator. It's like, well, I can't study with this rattle going on. So instead of trying to fix, like, just tune out the noise or find some way to avoid the noise, let me go fix the refrigerator. Any kind of technical thing could be a distraction.
Another thing, Jay, is for me, it's desire.
Hmm.
If I have something that I really want to know or want to address, then I'm highly motivated, and that's helpful. But
Hmm.
to me, to get to that stage, usually takes a lot. But I know that if I have that fire lit, then I'm certainly more gung ho to, I need to find the answer type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it helps you focus. Next thing about your environment, interruptions are just what it sounds like. If you're in a place where people are going to be talking to you, like if you're going to be studying at a restaurant or a coffee shop or a library, anything where there are people around, there's a potential, excuse me, that people are going to be interrupting you. And that might not be directly talking to you or interacting with you, could be just somebody nearby. If you're in a restaurant, somebody drops something, breaks a glass. All of these things can be interruptions that you can plan ahead for. You can't study at home. You have to go somewhere to study. You can choose a better place to study. Like, if you know that this particular place is going to be too noisy, you're not going to be able to focus, then, maybe find a different place. The library is usually a good place for that. If you can bring your own computer, I think most libraries today will have a Wi-Fi that you can, if you have a laptop, you can bring it and hook it onto their Wi-Fi. Or they have computers of their own that you can use, but that's limited value if you have your own favorite tools, your Bible, your notes. That's not really as accessible on a public computer, and you wouldn't want to access your own personal notes on a public computer like that, even if they are up in the cloud somewhere. So anything you can do to mitigate interruptions, and this might be going into an office and closing the door, or just letting everybody know, like if you're at home, letting everybody know, don't interrupt me right now. Give me an hour where no interruptions. Other interruptions could be from work, telephone, if you're on call, even out of your normal work schedule, you could be interrupted. So, and if you're on call, especially, kind of depending on what your job is, maybe you can't avoid that. You just have to be available sometimes, and that you may not be able to work around that. Just something to think about ahead of time. If you're aware of these kinds of interruptions, that they could happen, then that helps you think about ways that you can mitigate them, rather than waiting until they happen. Number 3, focus. This is something that you mentioned, Scott, like if you're really motivated in what you're trying to study, this will help you focus. Eliminating distractions and planning around interruptions is a big part of that. But there's some internal motivation here, like what you were talking about, Shubha, trying to get yourself into the right mindset. I'm curious what you all do. I mean, for myself, eliminating audio distractions and playing music helps me to really focus on what I'm doing. What do you do to help stay focused, not let your ADD take over?
One of the things I learned from a guy named Scott Adams, who's got a lot of reframing and good author type advice, is he said when you're set it up as a system versus a goal.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then also don't get discouraged. I've got other things, but another big thing he was saying is like to not be discouraged if like you're planned for an hour and you only get 5 minutes or something like that, because consider that like a victory. Even put that in your little calendar saying, I had an opportunity to focus to do this 5 minutes this day. And then, because it keeps it from disrupting your system of studying, because sometimes a person can get discouraged, like every time I sit down, somebody needs something.
Mm-hmm.
And, it turns into this almost self-fulfilling, procrastinating anxiety monster. Right. And, so that's the thing is when you set up your time, if you can do that and it gets disrupted, don't become discouraged. Re-hit it that next day at that next time, or if you can sometime later. But anyways, just have your system set up so even if you don't quite make what you wanted to spend on that time, that's still a time of victory where you had that time and you're building, kind of like building muscles. You want to try to do a 250 or 275 bench and you make whatever 245 or something and whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
The other thing was, one of the things he said that really struck me was posture. So he said what you don't want to do is find a comfy chair and put your feet on an ottoman and just snuggle in and you're going to do some reading. That's
Mm-hmm.
snooze time for me anyways.
Yeah.
And so he was saying to find a good posture chair, but to put your feet flat down on a hard surface and and then so you have this kind of mentally and physically your body is and your mind is like set in the same zone. Mm-hmm. Versus your body's like, boy, it sure is comfy here, and your mind's like, no, I got to read this Leviticus 23, like that kind of thing. So yeah. Posture and a system.
Yeah. And I want to come back to that one here in a little bit because that's actually going to be part of number 4 here. Yeah. Okay. But another thing you can do to help stay focused is to have a plan. What are you studying and what is your goal? Are you just going to sit down, open the Bible and study a passage? Or is there a specific passage or a specific topic that you want to study, and what do you want to get out of it? Like if you are working on the book of Ephesians, what chapter and verse are you starting with? And it may be a little difficult before you've started reading, but usually if you're going to study a book, then you start by reading the whole thing and then you go back to the beginning. So you have an idea of what the book is talking about and you've already started studying. So when you sit down for the next part, take some notes. Like, these are the highlights of this passage. These are the words that are repeated. These are the concepts in here. And over the next half an hour, 45 minutes or an hour, I want to look at this passage and define these words or define these concepts. What is Paul trying to say by repeating this word 5 times in this one chapter? So if you've got a checklist that you're going down or some kind of path to follow, that helps you stay focused. If there's a specific question you're trying to answer, rather than just meandering through scripture, that can also be very helpful. Now, if you're doing a verse by verse study, then, studying a particular topic isn't very helpful unless you get to a verse that talks about something that's difficult. And now, in order to proceed and understand this passage, you have to figure out more about the topic in this verse. Well, now you've got a topical study, and you got to figure out what the rest of the Bible says about it. But that can also be a distraction. So that's why it can help to have a plan ahead of time. Like, how much time am I going to spend on this? How far do I want to go? What am I trying to get out of reading and understanding this passage, etc. All right, so let me go on to number 4, which is comfort. And Timothy kind of touched on this a little bit, in this idea of be comfortable, but not too comfortable, I think is valid for just about everybody. If you are, you're sitting in your lazy boy chair, you got your feet up, you're probably just going to fall asleep. I'm sure there's somebody out there who's not going to fall into that trap, but for most people it is. And there is a subconscious thing going on with your posture. If you are in a posture that is conducive to focusing on something and paying attention, learning, then it's going to be easier for you to do that. That may be a little bit different for each person. Maybe standing works better for you, but laying down probably doesn't work for many people. Lounging in a chair probably doesn't work for many people. It just depends on how much you want to get out of what you're studying. Other aspects of comfort: hunger and thirst. Your physical needs. Are you hungry? Is that going to distract you from being able to concentrate? But then you have to pay attention to what you eat, and Paula could probably speak more onto this. But if you're going to eat a bunch of carbs, well, there's a chance that you may not be able to focus so well after that. You might just want to go to sleep instead of learn something. Same thing with thirst. If you're going to be thirsty, then you're going to have a hard time concentrating. So, the solution to that is to have something available. If you know that this is going to be an issue, take care of it ahead of time, or have something there with you. Honestly, sometimes it helps me to have a snack sometimes to be able to focus on what I'm doing. And I know that can help remove at least one distraction. And if I don't have something to fiddle with, something to be sipping from or snacking from, then I'm going to be looking for something.
Jay, I don't know where this would fall, but within what you're discussing, I know my son is a doodler.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how, I don't understand it. It's not me, but that particular act, while he was taking, and my wife similarly, while taking in information, that's essential. So there's some people that need to have that type of outlet.
Yeah, I'm the same way. If I am listening to a lecture, I can't just listen, because my mind is going to be wandering and I won't have a clue what was just said. And one of the things that I do is I play a game that's essentially the same as solitaire for me. It doesn't take a lot of thought, but that can also be a distraction, because sometimes I get a little, I start thinking about that instead of what I'm listening to, and I'll miss things. But I can't just listen to somebody talk about something, because then I won't be listening at all. If I've got a pad and pen, like if I'm at a church or a seminar or something, I will be doodling the whole time. Taking notes obviously is very helpful. Just depends on what you're listening to and what you're trying to get out of it and who you are. As far as your physical comfort, your temperature, do you need to have air blowing across you? Is a fan on? Would that be a distraction to you? Are you wearing comfortable clothes? I mean, that seems like a silly thing, but if you're wearing something that's going to be uncomfortable, well, maybe you should change, because that could be a distraction. Or on the other hand, is that going to put you to sleep? And maybe you do need to wear something a little uncomfortable. Maybe you need to put your camel hair coat on. These are the kind of things that are going to be very personal and different between each person, just like you were saying about your son, Scott. So I'm curious about what kind of, the physical distractions, what kind of things get in the way of you being able to concentrate around the concept of the comfort of your environment.
Time of day is tough. I mean, if I've had a hard day
Mm-hmm.
working, like if we're doing the Bible study, I've at times just been there trying to participate, but
Mm-hmm.
that's just the discipline of being there. So, if you're tired or if you just ate, that type of thing can come into play. And sometimes you just have to realize this is the way it's going to be right now,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and any kind of health issue, whether it's just being tired from a long day, or if you have trouble with fatigue, if you have joint pain, you have a hard time sitting in one spot for too long, all kinds of issues like that can be a problem, can distract you from being able to study and learn. So just being aware of those things and planning for them, eliminating distractions, making allowances or eliminating interruptions, making a plan, setting up the things that you need to help you focus in your study, and making sure that you're not going to be uncomfortable or too comfortable. You're not going to have to run to the bathroom every 20 minutes, or you're not going to fall asleep. All of these things are just part of planning ahead. And, once you know yourself really well, you won't have to put a whole lot of thought into this. But if it's a problem, if you find out that you are having a problem staying on task and studying, then it's probably a good idea to go think about these things, think about them a little more deliberately. Maybe write yourself a list, like look around, what's going on? What can I possibly change? And you can't change everything. Sometimes you just have to deal with what you've got. Shuba was talking about how your mind wanders. And Scott touched on the emotional state, especially after, fatigue from a hard day. Clutter is something that can be a problem. I haven't read any of these studies, but I have seen like people talking about studies where just having clutter around you, a visually busy environment can overload your brain and prevent you from processing things efficiently or forming new memories. It doesn't mean you're not going to form any new memories or be able to think about anything, but it's an impairment. And, sometimes if I were sitting in a bare cubicle with nothing on the walls, that would probably drive me nuts. I would have to be really excited about what I was studying. But having just stuff everywhere, junk around you, a dirty environment, that would be a distraction and create all kinds of problems. And security. And if you don't feel like you are secure in the place where you're at, whether it's you're in a public place where, you're worried about, I don't know, there's sketchy people around, or you're living with people who are maybe not the safest people to be around, whatever it is, these things can cause you significant distress and distractions, keeping you from being able to study too. And of course, those are a big problem for your whole life. So if there's a way to mitigate that, that won't just help your studies, that'll help all kinds of stuff. Peace of mind has value in just about everything you're going to do. The materials, the stuff that you need for Bible study. So we've talked about the environment and how your environment can mostly help you focus, or it can be a distraction. And you have to mold your environment to help create a space that's conducive to study and learning. But then you have to have something to study. And so the first one, obviously you need Bible. You need Bibles, plural. And we'll get to exactly why that is a little bit later. You need reference materials. There's a whole bunch of different references that I'm going to recommend that you have. Well, there's a few types of references I'm going to recommend that you have available. Exactly which references, there are thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of different things that you could use. So there's a lot of personal preference involved there. You need notes. If maybe you've got a photographic memory and you just never forget anything that you've read or thought about, but I certainly don't. I learn new things all the time and then forget them again. So I have copious notes from my Bible study. I have I keep my notes in Word documents, and they actually got so big that I had to cut them up into multiple documents. I've got one for each book of the Torah, and then I've got one for the rest of the Old Testament. And I've got a book for the Gospels in the book of Acts and one for the apostolic writings. And I have lots and lots of notes. And that way, whenever I get back to a passage and I want to study this, I can go back and review my notes from last time I was there. And that can really be helpful. Commentaries, good and bad. We'll talk about that more here in a little bit. So Bibles, there are different kinds of Bibles. And we've talked about this a little bit before. You know, we had Tim Haig on, and I can't remember who else it was. We had on talking about Bible translations. And we talked a little bit about the different kinds of translations there are. And I recommend that you have multiple Bibles of different kinds of translations. And I recommend that you have at least two of this first kind, which are the formal equivalents. So formal equivalence means that it's not exactly word for word, but it's fairly literal. So the translators are trying not to take many liberties with the text. They're trying to be as literal as they can, but still make it so that it reads easily and flows. And there may be cases where they have taken some kind of colloquial or idiomatic expression and translate it into something equivalent in English, but not exactly, because idioms just don't translate well. They don't always do that. Sometimes they just translate the idiom word for word because either they don't know that it's an idiom or they don't know exactly how to translate it. Every translation is going to be a little bit different. So there are a few that I recommend. New American Standard Bible, English Standard Version, the New King James Version, the Holman Christian Standard. The King James fits into this category. It's a great translation, but I don't really recommend it for most people because it's just difficult for people to understand. And sometimes it tricks people, not deliberately, of course, but it tricks people into thinking they're understanding what they're reading when they're not, because it uses the same English words, but it means something different by them. So I generally don't recommend the King James to people. If you really like the King James, I'd recommend the New King James Version. So I said NASB, ESV, King James, New King James, Holman Christian Standard Bible. So I'm curious what you all use. I suspect that it's going to be pretty similar for formal equivalents. We'll get to other kinds of translations here in a minute.
Yeah, that was really cool talking to Tim there. It's interesting. I like some of his thoughts, but I also thought it was kind of neat that the church I went to was just big on King James. They had two mottos. So, we're not King James only, but we can see it from here. And sell your shirt for a Schofield. But I'm just saying that was where I came from. But I, for the life of me, could not read. I mean, I was reading the King James, and I'm like, you know, if I wanted to write a poem to my girlfriend, I would use King James words because they're romantic and lovely, and there's got the Ionic pen and whatever. So I got the King James, and I went and talked to my pastor because I used to work on his house on stuff. And I said, you know, Pastor, I just got to tell you, maybe with a little shame, but I cannot read the King James. If I'm reading something, I need to have it make sense with my understanding and culture and language, you know, Borders language culture. And I said, so I've got this. I went for the Ryrie's 1994 New American Standard, and it was so cool the way he kind of went. He looked down, and it was almost like I had vocalized the frustration of a lot of the people in a way. The next Sunday, he says, I just I don't want you guys to think that if you're not reading the King James, blah blah blah, he says you can have any whatever. He actually kind of reiterated that the you know many versions of the Bibles. He said, I don't like the Living Translation. I think it's a dead translation myself, but that's up to you. And then it was just kind of it was just kind of neat. But yeah, the New King James or a New American Standard, I really like.
Shubha, was there something you wanted to add?
Yes, just to say the Bibles that I use.
Mhm.
I had purchased my very first Bible almost 26 years ago when I first became a Christian.
Mhm.
And at that point, somebody who had led me to the Lord at that point had said, "Oh, you must have the NIV Study Bible." And
Yeah.
this was back in India. And it's this really thick, huge Bible. So I'm super emotionally attached to it still because it was my very first Bible that I
Mhm.
purchased. But then my pastor, after that, encouraged me to purchase the New King James Version. So I used that. And then after coming to America, I discovered the ESV and the Holman's. So
Mhm.
these are the four Bibles that I still use.
Yeah, and the NIV is a dynamic equivalence, and it's pretty good for a dynamic equivalence. And there are a lot of different versions of the NIV too, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And I'll also touch on some warning signs to watch out for. I mean, in our studies, there are only two Bibles that I've told people that I don't want them to use, and that's the Passion and the Et Sefer. But there are hundreds of English translations, and I haven't looked at, 95% of them probably. So there may be others that I'll have a problem with, but rather than just find all the Bibles that I don't like, I mean, I'm not going to tell you what Bible you can and can't read. I'll give you some ideas of things to watch out for that could be problems. So we'll get to that after we talk about all the different kinds of translations.
I have to say I got into a rut once, looking for translations based upon, what was the language that Yeshua spoke?
Aramaic.
Aramaic. Well, I thought that was the gold standard at one point, and then I realized not so much, because it was a niche, so I think you have a good basis of NASB, ESV, and having a number of them is the important thing. A number of different translations you can refer to. I think that's important.
Yeah, I think having at least two formal equivalent translations is essential. The reason that I think having the formal equivalence Bibles, if you don't have any other one, get a formal equivalent translation. And that's because the translators are taking the least amount of liberties with the text that they think is warranted. Now, there's going to be some differences. The ESV in the books of Hebrews and Romans, I think, takes way too many liberties with the text. Romans isn't as bad as Hebrews. Hebrews is just crazy in some places, the things that the translators do. But they do that in a lot of translations, and I think that's a problem. But the less formal equivalent the translation is, the more liberties they're going to take. And that means the further you're getting from the original from the original text. If you are reading a translation, you are reading, to some extent, you're reading commentary, because the Bible wasn't written in English. And anytime you translate anything from one language to another, you're going to lose some of the meaning. That's just inevitable. You're losing cultural context and the subtleties of language. If you get a thesaurus and look up any word in English and find 10 synonyms, each one of those synonyms is going to have a subtly different meaning. There is no exact synonym for any other word. And that's true in other languages too. And those differences can be different in a different region. People in the Galilee would have had slightly different meanings for a lot of words than people in Judea. since the entire Bible was written in Hebrew, Greek, and a tiny bit of Aramaic, then getting as close to those original languages as you can, and then having multiple translations that you can compare to see, well, this guy or this group of people thinks it means this, and this group of people thinks it means this. Well, maybe it means one or the other, or maybe it's something in between. It just gives you something to compare to give you an idea of the range of possible meanings. And, I made a point there of saying a group of people instead of an individual. Here, I'll give you this warning from the beginning. I'm not going to say stay away from translations that were made by individual people, because there can be some value in that. But there's more commentary in a translation made by an individual person than by a committee. Usually things run by committees get all crazy and they never get things done. But when it comes to a translation, the more people who had input on how that word or phrase or passage is rendered into English, the better it's going to be, especially if those people have different viewpoints, because their biases tend to cancel each other out a little bit sometimes. Of course, if they're all
similarly, Jay, you should take the tact of what is the stated vision of that translation, like the complete Jewish Bible. That there are Bibles out there that are attempting to give you a Jewish mindset, and it's nothing wrong with that, but understand that you're going down that path if you're focusing upon that type of translation.
Yeah. And as long as you know it ahead of time, then you're aware that you're reading a bit of commentary mixed in with the biblical text. It's not just the straight text. Even a Bible that's translated by a committee, if all of the people are kind of on the same doctrinal area, then they're going to be reinforcing each other's biases. So that can happen too. And you got to watch out for that. It really helps to know who created this Bible and why. In most Bibles, you can just look it up online. What organization commissioned this translation? Who was involved in the work? You can't get the specific names for most translations. Maybe if you look hard enough, you can. But for most of them, you just get an idea of the organizations behind it and what their methods were in choosing the scholars who did the translation work. But that can give you a pretty good idea of where they're coming from and what kind of bias you're going to find in the text. But the more scholars involved in the broader their doctrinal and education perspectives, the better in general the translation is going to be. All right, so let's move on to the next translation type. Word for word translations. Word for word translations are super literal. The translator is not trying to give you an accurate meaning of a phrase. It's trying to give you accurate meaning of words. Now you're never going to find an exact word for word translation of anything, because there just are no translations for some words. Sometimes you have to translate a word in one language into a phrase in another language, or the other way around. So saying it's word for word is still in the formal equivalence domain of translations. But there are some specific translations that I recommend here. And I recommend that you have at least one of these. More is better. And that's Young's literal translation and the literal standard version. Young's literal was one that I was actually just warning against, not really warning against, just exercise some caution in that it's a translation made by a single guy. And he probably had help. I don't really know much about the guy. And this was done in the late 19th century. So the language can be a little bit dated, but it's modern enough that it's pretty good. Literal translations have a problem in that they're difficult to read because they're awkward. The formal equivalent translations will take an idiom in one language and they'll try to translate it into something that makes sense in the second language. Word for word will frequently just translate the idiom, and you just have to know that there's an idiom there. So, one idiom that I use a lot is, as an example of this kind of thing, is I work my fingers to the bone. Well, I'm sure that happened sometime in history, but most people, when they say that, they don't really mean it literally. They just mean they worked really hard. So Young's literal translation would translate, I worked my fingers to the bone. And so then if you take that too literally, you're going to say, oh man, this guy worked so hard, his finger bones were sticking out of the end of his fingers. And that's not really what the author meant. So you can get into a little bit of trouble if you use a word for word translation as your primary text, but it's a really good aid in understanding the Bible. You use a formal equivalence as your primary text. And then when there's something that sounds like it's probably an idiom, or you're like, I don't really understand what this is saying. Or if you look at two different translations and they have a big difference between how they're rendering a particular phrase, go to the word for word translation to see, okay, here's what the Hebrew, like, or the Greek, whichever, likely translates to exactly word for word, or as close as you can get it. And here's how these other translations tried to turn that into something that makes sense in English. So then you can get a good idea of which one you think is closer to what the author meant. A word for word translation is just a good tool to have to check against the others. Not something that you read as your primary study tool, but just something to help you understand what's behind the text on the other ones. Yeah, if you've done the chiasm course, then you'll see how some of that works, and that sometimes you can't see a literary chiasm in the text by looking at a translation because they've rearranged the words to make it make sense in English. So you go to a word for word translation like Young's literal, and it tries to maintain the same word order in the original. So then you can see the literary patterns in the text, or at least some of them. So Young's literal translation and the literal standard version are the ones that I have. I've been using the YLT for years, and I only just discovered the LSV recently. Apparently, it just came out in 2020, so it's not that old. And the LSV was done by a committee of scholars instead of just one, so I'm interested in looking at that one a lot more now. So dynamic equivalence, and here's where we start getting ourselves into real trouble. Dynamic equivalence means that they put more emphasis on making the text sound right in English, trying to convey what they believe the author was really trying to communicate, rather than being a strictly faithful translation of the words. And this can be good because, sometimes even with a good formal equivalence translation like the NASB or the ESV, sometimes things just sound awkward and lose some meaning. So you break out your NIV or your Complete Jewish Bible, and you'll read it in this translation, and all of a sudden, oh yeah, okay, this makes sense now. The danger with that is that you're really reading a commentary instead of a translation, or at least it's more of a commentary. You're reading what the translator believed the author was trying to communicate, and the translator isn't always going to be right. So you just have to be aware of that. And some dynamic equivalent translations are better than others. We were talking about the NIV earlier, and the NIV gets a lot of shade thrown on it. People calling it the nearly inspired version, and I've done that myself. And new NIV is the New International Version. And when it first came out, I think, was that in the 70s, I think, when that first came out, it was a huge hit. I mean, everybody's reading the NIV all through the 70s and 80s. But then they started changing it some more. New editions, the NIV Youth Bible, the NIV Women's Bible, the NIV this and that. And each one had different twists on the text where they would translate things in different ways to fit a particular culture or to fit a particular ideology. And that's just plain compromise, as far as I could tell. At that point, you've given up on being a faithful translation, and now you're just pandering to what somebody wants the Bible to say, rather than what the authors were trying to tell them. And I would stay away from any Bible that is geared towards telling people what they want to hear.
Where would you put chronological order? I've seen a few of those lately.
Chronological Bibles. Well,
Yeah, does
again,
that fall within this category, or?
well, this kind of, sort of. I mean, the specific text, like a chronological gospel, where somebody has taken harmony of the gospels. That's what it's called. Obviously, a chronological Bible, they can rearrange all the text to be in a different order so that it flows historically. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that as long as they're being faithful to the text. Now, the harmony of the gospels, I have a little bit more of a problem with, because now they're, taking apart Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and kind of merging them together into a single work. And it can be helpful to get a good flow of how the gospels work, but I would not use that as a study tool. That's just like, if you want to just read through it to get an idea of how whoever put this Bible together thinks that timeline worked, there's some value in that, but it would not be in my study tools. All right, so dynamic equivalence, the early NIV translations, 70s and 80s, early 80s, I think those are fine. There's going to be problems because they're dynamic. So I would never use one as my primary study Bible. International Standard Version, I would put Complete Jewish Bible. I would put that in this category too. The New Living Translation, and there's a range of dynamic equivalents too. There's less dynamic and more dynamic. The early NIV translations are less dynamic, a little bit more on the literal side. New Living Translation, that's more on the more dynamic, less literal. So the more dynamic it is, the less valuable I think it is as a study tool. Does anybody have any dynamic translations that they really like to use? Like I said, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. I'm just not recommending it as a primary study Bible.
I like to put my own dynamics into the translation, Jay.
I am not surprised.
So you're asking us to admit that we're using these things you don't recommend?
No, I didn't say I didn't recommend them. So I don't know if you guys can hear Paula in the background. I do recommend sometimes using a dynamic translation. I just don't recommend using it for your primary study Bible. Like, I have a Complete Jewish Bible, and sometimes I'll open it up and read it just because for the flavor and perspective that it gives. But I would never depend on it for actually trying to understand what the author meant to say. It's really a tool for knowing what David Stearns thinks the author had to say.
Where would you put what's one with the olive tree?
Tree of Life.
Tree of Life. Where would you put that one?
I would put that one it's a dynamic equivalent translation, but it's less dynamic in some places. In the New Testament, where they frequently insert Hebrew words, where the original had Greek, well, it's an English translation. So why are you doing that? I don't think that's very helpful. It's like, we just want to give this a Jewish flavor. I go, okay, I guess if we were, if English was our second language and Hebrew was our first language, then maybe this would be an interesting tool for helping us learn English better. The Tree of Life is a great translation most of the time. I just don't really understand the point of translating Greek words into Hebrew words in an English translation.
Oh, I've seen some translations. I don't remember what they were, but they'll have you read from the back to the front to try to give you that Hebrew flavor. And it's just an oddity for me, but they're just trying to give you a mechanism for, I'm thinking differently, I guess.
Yeah, I have a Jewish study Bible that does that. Yeah, and that's because Hebrew reads from right to left. So a Hebrew book opens on the right and moves to the left. So if they're trying to be very Jewish about it, or writing to a Jewish audience, sometimes they'll do that. But yeah, that can be a little off-putting and confusing at times. Next translation type, and this really isn't a translation at all, and it's a paraphrase. And really, these are spectrums of translation, from word for word at one end to paraphrase at the other end. Word for word being the most literal, paraphrase being the least literal. And some examples of these would be the Message or the Living Bible, the Good News Bible. I do not recommend these Bibles. I don't recommend them for flavor, as a children's book, a children's Bible, that's essentially a paraphrase. I mean, not essentially, that is a paraphrase. And that's fine if you just want to give your kids a story Bible, as long as everybody knows that that's what it is. It's just a storybook. So I would not recommend that anybody read like an adult, or, unless you have learning disabilities or serious challenges in reading comprehension, don't bother with the Message or the Living Bible, Good News Bible, or any of those. Not telling you can't read them, obviously, but since we're talking about studying the Bible, I don't think they're useful. And I think they probably do adults more harm than good. The fifth type, this doesn't really fit cleanly into this spectrum of from literal to non-literal, and that's Amplified Bibles. Amplified Bibles are a study tool, kind of a literal translation with a little bit of lexicon or something kind of mixed in. It's not really a lexicon because it doesn't usually give you the original Greek or Hebrew words, but an amplified translation will give you a much longer paraphrase of a verse, or will sometimes give you alternate translations. Like it'll translate the Greek into one word, and then in brackets or parentheses, it'll give you 4 other words that you could translate this into, or give you a longer drawn out version of the same sentence to give you a more complete version of what the author thinks, or what the translator thinks the author was trying to say. So Amplified Bibles can be helpful for study, but if you have a good Hebrew and Greek lexicon, then that's better than an Amplified Bible, in my opinion. Having an Amplified Bible is good if you don't have your lexicons available and you just want to have a quick idea of what some alternate translations of a particular word would have been without having to look them up in a dictionary. Here's where I want to talk about some of the things to watch out for in translations. And I've talked about this quite a bit already. Watch out for translations that are created by an individual. Doesn't mean you shouldn't use them, that they're terrible. It just means this is a red flag. You need to be aware that this is one person's opinion of what this passage means. Some examples of translations made by individual people. We already mentioned the Complete Jewish Bible. It's done by David Stearns. Modern King James Version, which, it's not terrible, but it's just one guy doing it. And I'm sure there are lots of others that I have less familiarity with. I've got a spreadsheet here that I made a couple of years ago of 115 different English translations. Most of them are made by organizations, but some of them are made by individual people. Jay Green is the guy who did, I think he's the one who did the Modern King James. He also did a literal version, which isn't quite word for word, but it's pretty close. But again, it's one guy, just like Young's literal is one guy. So we just have to be careful with that. You want to watch out for Bibles that have an agenda. And they frequently won't tell you that they have an agenda, but sometimes they do. Like those special edition NIV Bibles, sometimes they'll say right on the cover, the NIV Bible for women. And if it's a study Bible, that usually means that they have a lot of study notes in it that are specially written for, a woman's perspective. And that's fine, as long as you understand that that's what it is, that it's commentary. It's not the Bible. But sometimes they actually change the translation. There's sometime in the 90s, the NIV, whatever committee created that, they actually created a version that had, that was gender neutral. Taking as many of the he's out and making them more generic. So the sons became children, things like that. And there are places in scripture where it says sons, and it clearly means all of the children of Israel, but it's pretty common in most languages to use a masculine pronoun or generic nouns as generic. So sons can be a stand-in for all of the children. Like in English, it used to be standard to say to use masculine pronouns if you didn't know the sex of the person you were talking about. So you would just say he. And everybody knew that this doesn't necessarily mean he. It could be a she. We just don't know. But when they translate it deliberately to make it gender neutral, they'll take a pronoun, say he, and make it they. Well, they has a specific meaning in English. You don't use a plural pronoun to refer to a singular person. We do it all the time now in English, and I think it's taking a lot of meaning out of text by doing that. And so I try not to, but that's the way that people write nowadays. It's just one of my pet peeves. Trying to think of some others. Shubha mentioned the Hallelujah scriptures. I have not read that one myself. I've only kind of flipped through it one time, and it seemed kind of like a gimmick to me. Like, we're just going to stick in the tetragrammaton in Paleo Hebrew characters, and we're going to use some Hebrew sounding words and some strange transliteration with lots of cues. I'm not really sure I understand the point, other than just giving it a Jewish or Hebrew flavor and making people feel special because they have a special Bible. Most people, when they're reading a translation like that, they're not trying to feel special. They're trying to find an accurate translation. And this makes them feel like they're getting a more accurate translation when they're probably not. Another thing to watch out for are Bibles that introduce new texts, new books that are not commonly recognized. And I understand that, what we call the Bible, the canon of the Bible, was, it evolved over a number of centuries. Collection of books that we consider canon really didn't solidify until, probably the beginning of the 3rd century. But at the time, there was no such thing as a Bible. There was a collection of books, and these books were circulated. I don't want to get into that a whole bunch. I mean, we've talked about that before, and I talk about that quite a bit more. I've got a couple of YouTube videos if you want to learn more about how we got the Old Testament, how we got the New Testament. I can send you a link to that, or I'll post one when I upload this recording. There are a set of books that almost every Bible believer recognizes as authoritative. And at least in the common Protestant Bibles, we cut those up into 66 books. And you've got other canons, the Eastern Orthodox and the Coptic and the Catholics, they all have their slight differences. The Catholics have the canon and then the deuterocanonical books, which means second canon. But the whole purpose of having a canon is to have something you can measure things by. If the thing that you're using to measure other stuff keeps changing, then how do you have a consistent measure? Now, if you take other books that may or may not be authoritative, I'm not saying they're not, and then you put them in the Bible, well, now your measuring rod that you use to measure other books has now changed. If we all have the same measuring rod, then we can use that to measure and evaluate other claims to inspiration. So, whether it's the Book of Enoch or Jubilees or Yasher or Maccabees, whatever it is, we can use these 66 books and say, okay, does this book measure up to this one? Are there conflicts? Does it contradict? Is it historically accurate like these books are? And then we can rule out these other things. And I'm not saying you shouldn't read those other books. I think that all of these, not all of them, but most of these books have value, and even value in Bible study. But putting them in your Bible and saying these are authoritative scriptures that we should be reading and holding up as, given by God, well, I think that's when you're getting yourself into trouble. I would keep those in a separate book, or like the Catholics do, in a second canon. I wouldn't call it that, and I wouldn't even put it in the same covers. But if a Bible includes Jubilees or Enoch or any of these other books, but doesn't clearly differentiate it as these are books that we think are really great, but they're not canonical, if they don't do that, I'd stay away from that Bible. I think that the translators or the authors, whatever they are, they have an agenda. They're trying to push these other books. They're trying to influence people's theology by including these other books. I don't necessarily know who's creating these translations. I don't know them personally, but it does show that there is an extra agenda there. I would, if you want to get, I've got a collection of extra biblical works on my shelf called the Lost Books of the Bible. And I think that's valuable to have. You know, I've read several, I haven't read all 4 of the books of Enoch, but I've read the first 2 and done some studying with those. And I've read Jubilees and the Testament of Abraham and lots of other extra biblical books. And there's value in reading those things, especially for historical context, in knowing what the people at the time those things were written thought about and how they viewed the world and God. And that gives you context for reading the canonical scriptures. I just don't mix the two. Another thing to watch out for: know who created your translation. Like I've got this spreadsheet with all these translations in it, and I tried to put like what organization created these. And I was surprised at how many translations the Catholic Church has commissioned. There are quite a few. It can be helpful sometimes to know what manuscript tradition the translators were working from, whether it's the Textus Receptus, with the Masoretic, or the Westcott, what's his name, their critical text, whether they're working from the Latin Vulgate. All of these things are helpful to know. And if a translation was put out by a specific religion or denomination, that's a red flag. I would not want to read a translation that was published by the Assemblies of God or the Southern Baptist Church or the Catholics or the Jehovah's Witnesses, or I want a broad spectrum of scholars working on that translation, not just one sect. I'm curious if you have any thoughts. We were talking about these translations. Let me go back to that slide. The different types of translations and things to watch out for. And I know there's going to be some disagreements about what constitutes a red flag. And, some people really love their Enoch or Jubilees or whatever other books that they've got in their Bible, and that's why people love those Hallelujah scriptures and the Et Sefer and things like that so much. And not going to argue about it. I'm just letting you know how I feel about it. But I am curious. Any other thoughts about translations? Any specific translations that you really like, or ones that you've seen that you've got a problem with? Any that you think are something that people should stay away from, and why?
I recall the Dake's Bible, which was basically the King James, but it was loaded with commentary, and his commentary was allegedly given in a vision in one night. I just don't like how that all came about in hindsight. I got it because that's the pastor of the church I was at had. Mm-hmm. And, just, okay, either this was a supernatural thing or it was just a marketing thing. So, but anyways, I throw that one out there. It's not a translation. It's mm-hmm. really just commentary. So.
Yeah, there's a problem with a lot of study Bibles.
Yeah, one of the things about also some of those deuterocanonical books and even some translations is it seems like there's a very subtle desire to question the deity of Yeshua. Mm-hmm. They slide in quite a little bit of emphasis on a separation in Elohim between the flesh and mm-hmm. the spirit.
Yeah, and in some cases, some of the deuterocanonical or pseudepigraphal or whatever apocryphal, whatever set of books you're looking at, in some cases they weren't treated as reverently as what we consider canonical scriptures. So they may not have been copied as faithfully because the people doing the copying weren't paying quite as much attention or didn't have the same qualms about changing the text to fit their own preconceived doctrines. So you'll get some Gnostic corruptions and things. And yeah, and like I said, a lot of those books are are worth reading after you have a really solid foundation in the canonical scriptures. I would not go reading the books of Adam and Eve until you really know your Bible well. And then you can see there's some pretty crazy stuff in there. And a lot of early Christians thought that book, and that one, and the Shepherd of Hermas, and other books like that, the Epistle of Barnabas, that those should have been included in the canon. But once you know your Bible really well, those books are nuts. They should not be in the Bible. And yeah, I mean, there's still some great stuff in all of those. But just like with every great book that's not divinely inspired, there's a lot of really bad stuff too. Or some bad stuff. You take your chances with it. So that's why I say know your Bible first.